Please be seated. May the words of my lips and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. Amen.
Amen.
As Jesus stepped out on land, a man of the city who had demons met him. For a long time he had worn no clothes, and he did not live in a house but in the tombs. When he saw Jesus, he fell down before him and shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me." Like so many of the people Jesus healed, he lived isolated from his community, in his case physically apart, relegated to the tombs outside the city. His estranged way of life was somehow less than human. He wore no clothes, as though he were an animal. They had tried everything to keep him under control. Chains could not hold him. He could escape a guard. Each time he would run off into the wilds. There may be very little for us to identify with in this character, traditionally called the Gerasene demoniac. To us, he may resemble Gollum from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, more than anything we can see in ourselves. But I put it to you today that we are, each of us, like him. To quote the spiritual writer Gerard Hughes, we are a jumbling conflict of desires. Now, at first hearing, this might all sound a little extreme, a little unbalanced perhaps. After all, our lives may be tidy, ordered, and stable. We don't sleep rough in the graveyard. In fact, we may be well regarded in our local community, or have enjoyed a successful career, or may be key members of local charitable organisations. And don't get me wrong, preachers do great harm to sensitive individuals if they convince them that they are worse than they actually are. That is not a message of good news, that is bad news. I am not saying that everyone's lives are unstable. That is clearly untrue. What I am saying is that we can all identify with the description of ourselves as a jumbling conflict of desires. And many of us can recall a time when life has seemed less than life to us, when we have metaphorically lived amongst the tombs. Has life ever felt like a game, a masquerade, a pretense that we have to keep up to avoid facing the inner chaos within us? St. Augustine of Hippo wrote vividly about his own inner chaos and how this was brought home to him before his conversion to Christianity by the example of a beggar. Augustine had made himself miserable, chasing honour and recognition as a giver of knockout speeches, seeking what he thought would bring him joy, but in fact brought trouble and difficulty and an uncertain prospect of happiness at best. Meanwhile, he saw a beggar on the streets, wandering the streets with a beaming smile on his face, jolly and carefree, even if only because of the booze. Granted, the beggar did not have true joy, but then neither did Augustine. This story is rather like a more modern story about inner restlessness and seeking joy. There was once an entrepreneur who went to the coast and found a poor fisherman sat on the dock with a pipe in his mouth. "Fisherman, why aren't you fishing?" asked the entrepreneur. "Because I have caught enough fish for the day," replied the fisherman. "Well, why don't you catch some more?" "What would I do with it?" "You could earn money. Then you could buy a boat with an outboard motor, which would allow you to go into deeper waters and catch more fish. Then you could invest in nylon nets, which would allow you to catch still more fish. And that would allow you to invest in 2 boats. And before you know it, you would have a fleet. and a business empire and be rich, like me. What would I do then? Then you could really enjoy life, said the entrepreneur. What do you think I'm doing now? Said the fisherman. Of course, the standard solution offered by preachers and writers to an inner restlessness, to seeking joy in things that cannot bring true joy, is to turn to God in faith and in prayer. Indeed, it was St. Augustine, aware of his own inner chaos and tendency to seek joy in things that could not bring joy, who later confessed to God that you have made us for yourself, and our hearts cannot find rest until it finds rest in you. The difficulty with this is that for many of us, prayer can make us even more aware of our inner restlessness and our inability to concentrate. We can sit down to pray only to find that our minds generate all kinds of distractions, most of them mundane, or some of them painful and regretful. We might even discover in ourselves that deep down we are unwilling to pray, that deep down we are avoiding intimacy with God, and would rather keep God at arm's length. We might make excuses why we can't pray, or our prayer life might be superficial in any of the myriad ways we find to ensure that our prayer lacks depth. We can discover in ourselves two movements, one towards God and one away from God, both at the same time. Again, we are like the Gerasene demoniac, who in one at the same moment runs up to Jesus and falls at his feet, acknowledging him as the Son of God, and at the same time begs him to leave him alone. What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me. We run up to Jesus in prayer, we acknowledge him as the Son of God, yet we might also want to keep him at a safe distance, in case he torments us. The root cause of this is a false view of God. Gerard Hughes again tells the story of Uncle George, a caricature of a certain false view of God. Uncle George is a gruff old relative, which Mum and Dad take us to see periodically. Mum and Dad seem to love Uncle George, but at the end of the visit, Uncle George says, "Now look here, make sure you do what I tell you to do, and be sure to come and visit me, or else." And as we go home, clutching Dad with one hand and Mum with the other, Mum leans over and says, "Now don't you love Uncle George?" And so, a split has occurred in our religious minds. We keep telling Uncle George how much we love him, yet secretly we are afraid of him. We have become like the Gerasene demoniac. We have two movements within ourselves, one towards God and one away from him. And people are complicated. If our religion is full of shoulds and oughts, that is quite a good sign that an image something like Uncle George still lurks in our hearts. The good news is that it is possible to dig out false images of God and to calm the inner chaos. Just as his encounter with Jesus leaves the Gerasene demoniac sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind, so can persistence in prayer root out our false images of God and resolve our conflicting desires. It begins by recognizing that our false images of God are the cause of the split in our religious minds. It begins by truly and deeply feeling that God loves us at least as much as the person who loves us the most. It might be the work of a lifetime, but we are not alone. Jesus has gone out of his way to meet us.